Hello there, welcome to this video in which I will show you everything you need to know about painting with my watercolor brushes. I am going to show you my favorite and most basic set, which is my watercolor essentials. It's got 14 brushes, one pencil brush, one eraser brush, one smudge brush to use with the smudge tool here, one all-rounder, one detail brush, one of my favorites, the Real Matte Glaze, a dark edges liner, two wet into wet brushes, one that multiplies and one that doesn't, one that I call my organic texture builder, one that makes a great background, one that makes an even greater background, one with very versatile specs, and one with a paper brush. So the first thing you need to have, a couple of things first. This is my Saunders Waterford texture that I made from scanned Saunders Waterford paper. It's got the texture here, a layer that creates a bit of texture on white bits of the paper, and a highlights layer. So I'm going to collapse these because we don't need to see them all the time. You can find this pre-made texture in my paper pack for Procreate. If you don't have something like that, but if you have the Essentials brush pack, what you can do is this. I'm going to make this invisible so now we don't have a texture. What I'm going to do, so you see what I'm doing, is just paint a bit of color back here. So now you see there is not much in the way of watercolor texture apart from what the brush brings with it. Digital watercolor needs texture in order to work as digital watercolor. So what we'll do is we'll make a new layer on top of the line art, on top of everything, just like the pre-made texture is here. We will set this layer to color burn. We can already set it at something like 80-something%, and then we will pick the paper brush we have. I'll zoom out so I can cover everything. Then I will choose a color that is nearly gray and slightly above the 50% mark of how dark and how light it is. And I am going to use a very big brush and I will paint over this. And now if I zoom in, you can see that we have watercolor texture in place. And now this looks a lot more watercolory too, which you can see when I paint some more. So very watercolory now, a lot more than without it. So this is what you can do to help yourself if you do not have a pre-made texture like this. But I am going to get rid of this one because we have this texture in place, which looks very similar now. Two things that you need to know. Let's clear this layer. You can drag down 3 fingers to clear a layer. 3 things you need to know. The first is that your canvas should be pretty large for my brushes to work the way they are supposed to work. You can see that this one is set to 4500 to 6000 pixels at a resolution of 300 dpi. This is something that all my pre-made layers have because of course I need them to work to a maximum effect together with my brushes. So if your canvas is much smaller than this, what will happen is that the brushes will not work at smaller sizes the way that they are supposed to. So the best thing that you can do is to paint at roughly this resolution. One side should be around 4000 pixels. I think that's a good approximation. The other thing you need to know is that my brushes work with very light pressure. Otherwise you will get trouble with your hand because you have to press down on the paper very hard. So the first thing I did when I got my iPad was to go to Preferences, to Pressure and Smoothing, and set the curve to this. Normally it goes in a straight diagonal from bottom left to top right, and with this one you have maximum pressure sensitivity, and that is how my brushes, and actually most brushes I've ever encountered, are supposed to work. So now that we've got that out of the way, let me show you how I go about my my watercolor process. We have Agnes, a little children's book character from a book I wrote and illustrated a couple of years ago. She never got the watercolor treatment, so I decided that she absolutely was in for a bit of watercolor glory. The first thing I always do is to paint everything that will later be a particular color in one solid color. For that, I need just a basic brush, so basic that it's not even in here. Anything you have that looks like this will do the trick. So anything that has no texture built into it, and I'm going to go to a layer below my line art. Line art is here, and on a layer below my line art I am going to select a color that is close-ish to what the fur is going to look like in the end, and just start to fill it. I'm not worried about going over the edges, because later I will do the same thing for the cloak, for the ornaments and so on, and I will do them on layers on top of this one, so I'm not worried about going over the edges, except for places like this where we will clean that up. So I will just fill everything here. My filler brush is made so that it works well with the color drop tool. It's got some white edges left here, which normally is not visible in the finished watercolor, so these do not bother me. So I'm just going to fill all of this, and I will see you again in a moment. So now I am done filling everything that is hair or fur, bad pun, sorry, and I will just start doing the same thing for the other areas. I'm not bothered about the very solid color here. That does not look very much like watercolor apart from the texture I have, but this is just a placeholder that we will use later for our alpha lock layers, and I will show you that later. So let's make another layer on top of this and paint her little cloak, which is teal. New layer. Okay, that's very dark now, but as I said, that is just a placeholder anyway. So now I can just cover up and fix where I went over the edges earlier, and nothing of that is visible anymore. here I have everything ready for filling these bits, and we will do the same thing for the ornaments, for her little jacket, for the leather bits, and for her horns. I think I will put the leather bits and the horns on the same layer, because it's always a good idea when you're working at high resolutions to save layers where you can. So I will do that to show you. So we will pick a nice horn color and paint her little antlers. Again, just a placeholder. And her little pouches. Now, we should not go over the edge here. A bit is okay. Looks more handmade that way. There are ways, by the way, in Procreate to use the color drop tool without this workaround, but that requires a very detailed and very precise line art layer, which I don't have. So my line art is always very, very handmade, very pencil-y, so I always have little breaks that any color drop tool will not recognize and just flood the whole canvas, which would be so much work to clean up that this workaround really works much quicker. So I think we will not just put the horns and the pouches on that layer, but also the little ornament here. We will not be working with a lot of layers here. At this resolution, you usually have around 12, 13 to 15 layers for yourself, but and that sometimes is not a lot. But in this one, we are not going to be terribly restricted by the maximum layers we have. So I made a new layer for her little jacket. So everything that's left now will be jacket. All right, so we will need the stones, which might also go on that layer that we have here. Let's just do that so I can show you some things about working with these later. I will do that, do the stones in this color. I will just erase the blades of grass. I am going to put in the background now. That needs to go underneath everything else. So let's move that here. Usually works better with your finger, I don't know why. And I am going to go for Watercolor Essentials again. Let's go for the new all-rounder brush. And let's go for a color that's similar to the ones we have with the stones, but that's darker. And we will just paint something like this. And you can now see that the blades of grass that I just erased are now darker than the rest. So what we have now is the basic setup for starting to paint. I can still go in and use the smudge brush to roughen up some of these edges. It looks a bit like drawing the paint out with water, but I think I don't want that in this case. So I will leave it as this. I can go in and maybe make the background a little more even around the corners. Yep, I like that. I like that even more. So what we will do now is layer for layer, turn everything white. Hue, saturation, brightness, and then push the brightness to the right hand side. This now looks as if we had nothing painted at all, but we know we already did all the work. So what we can do now is to use my favorite kind of watercolor magic with Procreate. I can tap this and set this layer to alpha lock. An easier way to do that is to simply use 2 fingers and slide to the right. And then you have these typical little checkers that tell you your layer is on alpha lock. What does that mean? It means that if you do not have the layer on alpha lock, and if I paint over it now, I can paint everywhere, and what I did in the previous step was all for nothing. You can see that the paint does not go on these layers because these are on top of that and they're white, but what we will do is put it on alpha lock again, and then we will go to one of these wonderful wet into wet brushes. Let's use the non-multiply first and paint a very, very light layer. Let's do that color. Let's do a very light layer on this alpha lock layer, and that means that only what I have in place here will get colored now. So we stop where the color layer stops. I can go in with a second color, a slightly darker one maybe, for the grass at the bottom. More pressure means darker, less pressure means lighter. And if I switch to the multiply brush, that means a second stroke will make the area even darker, where some shadows will fall. I can now do this in a very rough step for all of these. So let's turn that to alpha lock as well. I normally don't name my layers. That is one of the things a lot of digital artists do not do. In my case, it's obvious which layer this is. I can see this is Agnes. I can see this is her cloak. I can see this is all the little bits I have. And maybe I can't see this, but by exclusion, I remember that this was a jacket. So I normally don't name them. You can go ahead and name them, of course, but that's usually a step I skip. So let's use a nice hairy color, very light. We don't want to go too dark now. And let's go for the wet into wet multiply brush again. So if you go over a bit for the second time, it will stack and go darker. So with a very large thing, we will just paint a little fur, and you can see that the paint only goes where Agnes is. Make her ears a bit darker, forehead a bit darker. This brush is really wonderful to add a bit of volume and depth without going too much into detail. If I want to go lighter somewhere, I can't do that with the same brush because it's a multiply brush, so you have to go to the non-multiply in order to have lighter colors again, for example for her little feet. But these could go darker before we go lighter. So back to non-multiply, back to the lighter color. And then make her little toes a little lighter. Also this bit. So that's all the detailing I'm doing for now. The next bits will come in the next stage. So what I'm doing is really work the same way as I would with watercolor and just put down base layers first with a bit of variation with light and dark, but not much. And I will go in with this layer and use a bit of smudging too. The smudging will also just stay within the lines and within the spaces that you outlined before. And something else I just noticed I forgot, the little leaves here, the ornaments, which can go on this layer too. So what we have now is the basic idea of the colors we want, and I can then go in layer for layer. That's what I usually do, starting with the first figure layer and leaving the background for later usually, and starting to detail. For detailing, I love my Real Glaze. This brush works best on the same layer, so I normally don't open a new layer for detailing, but use the same one. If you want to be on the safe side and not maybe ruin your layer, you can make a new layer on top, but if you want to use the Real Glaze, you need to set this to multiply. Otherwise, it'll just look boring and like nothing much. But we will use the same layer, and I will choose a color that works well with what I have here. Turn it a bit darker, so we will have a shade that works well with her fur. And go to the Real Glaze. It's preset at about this size, which is great for detailing, and this is what it looks like. So that is a very, very watercolory brush with this dark sort of outline and lighter bits on the inside. In order to have the watercolor look that we're going for, I'm going to use a lot of very rough edges with my Real Glaze brush. But in some places I'm going to use the smudge tool to soften these a bit. But make sure to leave some of these hard edges standing, because that's what really sells the watercolor look in the end. This brush here, the Real Glaze, stacks like no man's business. So if you use it on top of each other, then it will get extremely dark after a while. So if you put several strokes next to each other and overlapping each other, you will get very dark stuff. If you don't want that, go in with a smudge tool and just get rid of the dark bits. But again, if you leave some of these standing, even if you think they're ugly, in the end, they're going to sell your watercolor look. So basically what I'm doing now is just to detail everything, mostly with the Real Glaze brush. I will show you what the smooth detail does too. If you decide you don't want to have this stark edge, this hard edge at the side, you can go in with the detail brush. I would recommend color picking this, because you need that in a lot darker, because it doesn't glaze. The smooth detail brush is one that goes dark with pressure and light without. So you can use it like this. I'm going to do her eye now. The detail brush is a good choice for that. To make it really opaque, you have to go over one spot twice. A bit like gouache, really. And this is basically my entire process. So what I do is to just go layer by layer, starting with the bottommost and working my way up, so I don't forget one. And I just detail all my layers. Let's have some lighter fluff to her belly. I go to the non-multiply wet into wet brush for that. And there we have that. Little tail as well. Now I go back to this one. To do some more softer detail, I go to the wet into wet multiply brush, which also works well for detailing and shadows. In this case, what you can do is go in with a lighter color and the non-multiply wet into wet brush and just lighten it up a bit. So these are basically the brushes that I use all the time. The new all-rounder for large backgrounds to block in, smooth detailer for smooth detail. Real Mac Glaze is my go-to brush for detailing. The Dark Edges liner is really one that I don't use that much because I prefer the Real Mac Glaze. If the Real Mac Glaze is too stark for you and too dramatic, I recommend using this one instead. That has very similar effects, and you saw me using these two a lot. Organic Texture Builder is something that I often use for the background. I can show you that. Let's go for this and turn it a bit greener, and let's go to our background layer. That's on Alpha Lock, that's good. So I will just add a bit of cloudy stuff here. I'm planning to do something interesting with the background later, so I won't do that much detail on it now. But I will just keep doing some detailing on the cloak and her clothes and everything else now. Let's take a look at the background together, and I'm going to do something that I briefly tried last night, but apart from that, it's going to be a first. Let's take the save route now and make a new layer on top of our background. And this time we'll set that to clipping mask. Clipping mask is the same thing as Alpha Lock, but it does it on a different layer. So everything I paint on this layer will not go beyond the boundaries of what I have on this one. I will paint or draw or whatever you want to call it some trees, but they're just going to be outlines of trees. I will get rid of them later and I will just show you what I'll do. I will just use a dark color for that. Let's see how thick this is. That's fairly good. So I will paint these trees. So we have got a lot of quite interesting stuff going on in the background here. So I will make this a lot lighter now. Oh, actually, we'll just turn it to white. This already looks a lot like what I'm going for, but you can tell right now that this was not actual watercolor, because in real watercolor these bits would pool. So paint will always pool in areas where you stop painting, like here for example. I will make another layer on top of this, and I don't think there's any need to make it a clipping mask, so let's just work like that. And we will go for the real matte glaze. That means we can go a bit lighter here because the real matte glaze gets darker anyway. Oh wait, no, we are not working on this layer, so now we will use a darker matte glaze. Now I can show you what it looks like when it's not on the same layer. Ah, okay, that's fine then. So that's exactly what we want. And I'm just going to paint, negative painting really. Like I would in real watercolor if I had just outlined my trees in pencil or similar. Now we have this background, and if we get rid of the white trees, we will have a much softer effect. Let's unclip it first, and then we can just put it here and save it. And if we set this to clipping mask, we should get rid of these bits over there where I went over the edge, and yes, we do. And on this layer we can now just add some tiny bit of more detail, like these areas in the trunk where the branches begin. And in order to make this look even more traditional now, let's lock this layer, alpha lock it, and we can then just add some very subtle color variation with the non-multiply brush, for example, and just add a tiny bit of sunlight there to the background. So that really does a lot to bring out the background. We will just use the organic texture builder. I think that's better. I will still lighten this a bit and yellow it a bit, which will also help to differentiate it from the foreground. Yep, that looks better. Now we have this eerie mist here going on in the background. Let's have a look what bringing out some contrast with the curves will do. And that will do very nicely. Something that I sometimes like to do to make the foreground and the figure pop a little more is to make one layer that is comprised of just the foreground. I could just go and just paint over everything here, but that's an easier way of doing that. If you have one layer left, which sometimes you do not, you can duplicate and then merge. Always leave one previous layer unmerged. Duplicate this and merge with that. Duplicate this and merge with that, and move it to the top. This doesn't change anything right now, so if I turn it on or off, there is not much that's going on. But if I now simply, it's still on alpha lock, so what I can do is just use a big brush, non-multiply is perfect, and just paint it yellow. Big yellow rabbit. And when I now just go and set the opacity to just between 12 and 16%, what I have is a wonderful faint glow that ties the entire color scheme together and differentiates everything from the background. I very often do that, and that results in very soft and very harmonious color schemes. I can then see what this looks like if I slide this more into the brown area, which looks very natural. Now I'm going towards the blue. Over here we have green. That looks very eerie now, doesn't it? And just slide it back, I think about here, so a bit of a warmer yellow than I had before. So I love this very much now. So this is just a normal layer, just set to normal. If I multiply it, then it goes darker and adds more contrast. That could also be nice, but I really like it here with just making it a bit paler and a bit more harmonious. So that's what I love to do. And I think our little illustration is now finished. I hope this was very helpful for you, especially if you've been working with my watercolor brushes before. and I hope that now you have more of an idea what exactly you can do with them. So, happy painting and see you next time.